Hello, peaceful soul. I'm your storyteller this evening, here to help you unwind and drift into a gentle, restful sleep. Before we begin our journey, remember to like the video and subscribe for more calming bedtime tales. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And if there's a story you'd love to hear next, I'd be happy to bring it to life. My name is Jessica Miller. I was a college student trying to make some extra cash, so I babysat. Most of the jobs were easy. A few hours, kids asleep, I'd get some studying done. It seemed like a simple way to earn money. But then there was the Harrison house. That house and the child within it changed everything for me. It showed me that some imaginations are more real than you'd ever want to believe. This job with Leo Harrison was when I truly learned that some secrets aren't just hidden in the dark, they live in the minds of children. It was a Tuesday evening. The Harrisons' house was new, spotless. It smelled of lemon polish and new carpet. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison were very particular. They told me about their 8-year-old son, Leo. He was polite, a little quiet. Leo has a very active imagination, Mrs. Harrison said with a tight smile, almost like a warning. He talks to his imaginary friend, Whisper, a lot. Just ignore it. They gave me a list of rules as long as my arm and rushed out to a dinner party. Leo was already in his room, playing quietly. He was a small boy with bright, curious eyes. We talked for a bit, then he settled down to play with his action figures. I went to the living room, feeling good about the easy job. The house was calm, almost silent, except for the hum of the fridge. It was the kind of perfect quiet you rarely find in a house with a child. A little too perfect, maybe. I shrugged it off. It was a new house, after all. About an hour into the evening, I noticed something a little off. Leo was playing, but he kept looking over his shoulder, talking to the empty space behind him. "Whisper, don't do that," he'd whisper. Or, "Whisper, stop it, you're scaring me." He wasn't playing with an imaginary friend in the usual happy way kids do. He seemed genuinely troubled, almost scared. His eyes would get wide when he looked at the empty spot. I saw him shiver once, even though the room was warm. I tried to make light of it. "Who's Whisper, Leo?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. Leo looked at me with those wide eyes. "He's just Whisper," he said, and then added, in a very soft voice, "He doesn't like it when I talk about him." I laughed it off. Kids can be intense with their imaginary friends. It was probably just his way of making the friend seem more real. My gut, though, felt a strange twist. The air in Leo's room seemed to drop a few degrees whenever he mentioned Whisper. The small, unsettling details started to add up. I was sitting on the floor with Leo, building a tower of blocks. He was explaining a complex story about his superheroes. Suddenly, a small action figure, one that was part of the tower, toppled over by itself. There was no earthquake, no shaky table. It just fell. Leo quickly scooped it up, his eyes darting to the corner of the room. "Whisper," he muttered. "I told you not to mess with my toys." He didn't look at me, but his hand was shaking a little as he put the figure back. Later, while Leo was in the bathroom, I heard a faint, breathy whisper coming from his bedroom. It wasn't Leo's voice. It was too low, too airy, like wind through dry leaves. I crept closer to the door, listening. It sounded like words, but I couldn't make them out. It sent a shiver down my spine. When Leo came out, I asked him, "Who are you talking to, honey?" He just shook his head, looking down at his feet. "No one," he mumbled, but his eyes darted to his bedroom door. That night, before bedtime, Leo was drawing. He usually drew cartoon characters, but this time he drew a picture of a tall, shadowy figure. Its arms were long and spindly, its head was too small, and it had two small glowing red dots where its eyes should be. It looked like something from a nightmare. "Who is that, Leo?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. He looked up at me, his face pale. "That's Whisper," he said. Then he added, his voice barely a whisper, "Whisper says he doesn't like you." He stared at me for a moment, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. His eyes looked strangely empty, almost adult for a second. After I put Leo to bed, tucked him in tight, I went downstairs. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It felt heavy, watchful. I couldn't shake the image of that drawing or Leo's strange stare. I sat in the living room trying to read, but my mind kept going back to Whisper. The air felt cold in patches, even though the heater was on. Then, around midnight, I heard it. A soft thumping from upstairs from Leo's room. It was rhythmic, like something being gently, repeatedly tapped against the wall. Then came the whispers again, louder this time. Not the airy, almost inaudible whispers from before, but distinct low murmurings. My heart started to race. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but I couldn't leave Leo alone. I crept up the stairs, my steps soundless on the carpet. The thumping and whispering grew louder as I got closer to Leo's room. His door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open gently, peering inside. Leo was sitting up in bed, absolutely still, his back to me. He was staring intensely at the darkest corner of his room. "Leo?" I whispered. He didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. He just kept staring, his small body rigid. Then he started talking, his voice shaking. "No, Whisper, don't tell her," he pleaded. "She won't understand. She'll be mad." My blood ran cold. He was talking to it, and it was here, in the room. I stepped fully into the room, my eyes fixed on the dark corner where Leo was staring. The air was freezing, making my breath fog. "Leo, what's wrong?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but my voice trembled. As I spoke, a low, guttural growl rumbled from that dark corner. It wasn't an animal sound. It was deeper, more ancient, filled with a raw, predatory hunger. My eyes widened in terror. The darkness in the corner deepened, swirled, and began to coalesce. A tall, distorted silhouette started to take shape, its edges wavering like smoke. It was impossibly thin, its limbs stretched. And then, two faint pinpricks of glowing red light appeared within the shadow, right where its eyes should be. It was the creature from Leo's drawing. It was real. The shadow moved, slowly, deliberately, towards Leo's bed. My heart leaped into my throat. "Leo!" I screamed, lunging forward, trying to grab him, to pull him away. But as my hand touched his arm, his skin was icy cold, colder than anything I'd ever felt. He was stiff, rigid with pure, unholy terror, unable to move. He just stared at the approaching shadow, his mouth open in a silent scream. The shadow reached Leo's bedside. It loomed over him, its two red eyes burning. And then, Leo let out a scream. It wasn't a child's scream of pain or fright. It was a primal, gut-wrenching shriek of absolute, soul-shattering horror. At that moment, the shadow turned its head, its red eyes fixing on me, and a voice, dry and ancient, like parchment crumbling to dust, filled my mind. It wasn't spoken aloud, but echoed in my thoughts, making my head throb. "She knows." My mind shattered. The pure evil radiating from that thing was suffocating. I didn't stop to think. I didn't try to save Leo. I couldn't. I just turned and ran, stumbling out of the room, down the stairs, and out the front door, leaving it wide open. I didn't stop running until I was far away, in my car, shaking, sobbing, trying to breathe, trying to forget those red eyes and Leo's scream. I called the Harrisons, barely able to speak. They came home, found Leo unharmed, sleeping peacefully. They called the police, accusing me of child neglect and drug use. Child Services got involved but found nothing. No shadow, no growls, no evidence. The Harrisons moved a few months later, but the horror stayed with me. I quit babysitting, changed my major. I can't stand shadows now. Every time the wind whispers through the trees, I hear that awful, airy voice. I feel watched. I look at children, especially quiet ones, and I wonder what they really see in the dark corners of their rooms. I wonder what whisper is, and if it ever truly left Leo Harrison. And I wonder what it meant when it whispered in my mind, "She knows." My name is Maya Carter. For most of my senior year in high school, I spent my weekends babysitting to save up for a class trip to Europe. I was responsible, I was good with kids, and I figured I'd seen every kind of messy, loud, and chaotic situation a babysitter could handle. I was saving up the last $100 I needed when I saw an ad for a job that paid twice my usual rate. It was for a family called the Delacourts. They lived in a part of town I'd never been to, where the houses were old and sat far back from the road, hidden behind iron gates and ancient trees. I took the job, thinking only of the money. I've learned since then that some houses have rules you won't find written down in any handbook, and that some games should never, ever be played. The Delacourt house was something out of a Gothic novel. It was huge and imposing, with dark stone walls covered in ivy and tall, pointed windows that looked like watching eyes. When Mrs. Delacourt let me in, the first thing that hit me was the silence. It was a deep, heavy quiet that seemed to swallow sound. The inside of the house was filled with dark wood, heavy velvet curtains, and strange, unsettling paintings on the walls. It smelled of old paper and dust. Mrs. Delacourt was a tall, pale woman with sharp eyes. She introduced me to her two children, 9-year-old Lily and 6-year-old Leo. They were quiet kids with the same pale skin and serious eyes as their mother. They just stood there, holding hands and staring at me without saying a word. "They're very well behaved," Mr. Delacourt said, appearing from a shadowy hallway. He didn't smile. "They have their dinner at 7, and their bedtime is at 8:30. You won't have any trouble with them." He paused, and the look he gave me was incredibly serious. "There is just one rule. It's very important. You must not let them play the hide-and-seek game after the sun goes down." Mrs. Delacourt nodded, her face tight with anxiety. "It's a family game," she explained, her voice barely a whisper. "It has special rules. They know they aren't allowed to play it at night, but they might try to trick you. Don't let them." It was weird, but I just nodded and smiled. "No problem, no hide and seek. Got it." They seemed satisfied with that. They gave me a tour that felt more like a warning, pointing out rooms that were off limits and hallways I shouldn't go down. Then, just like the Hendersons, they left in a hurry, leaving me alone in that vast, silent house with two children who still hadn't spoken a single word to me. The evening was unsettling. Lily and Leo ate their dinner without a sound, their eyes glued to their plates. When I tried to make conversation, they would only give one-word answers. It was like they were afraid to make any noise. At 8:30, I took them upstairs to their rooms. Their bedrooms were at opposite ends of a long, dark corridor. I tucked Leo in first. He just stared at the ceiling. Then I went to Lily's room. She was already under the covers, her eyes wide in the dim light. As I was about to close her door, she whispered my name. "Maya?" "Yes," I said, relieved that she was finally talking. "If we start the game," she said, her voice small and shaky, "you have to find us. You have to, or he'll find us first." Before I could ask who he was, she rolled over and faced the wall. I closed the door, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. I went downstairs and tried to distract myself with a book, but the oppressive silence of the house was getting to me. Every creak of the floorboards above made me jump. I kept glancing at the dark windows, feeling like I was being watched from the sprawling black yard. An hour passed. The house remained quiet. Too quiet. I decided to go check on the kids one more time before settling in for the night. I walked up the creaking staircase. The upstairs hallway was long and filled with shadows. I peeked into Leo's room first. The bed was empty. The sheets were thrown back as if he'd left in a hurry. My heart started to beat a little faster. I hurried to Lily's room. It was empty too. I called their names. "Lily? Leo? This isn't funny." My voice was swallowed by the silence. No answer. I felt a surge of panic. I rushed from room to room, calling their names. Nothing. As I was about to run downstairs to grab my phone, I heard it. A tiny giggle that seemed to come from all around me. And then a whisper right behind my ear. "Ready or not, here we come." I spun around. No one was there. At that exact moment, the lights in the hallway flickered once, twice, and then went out. The entire house was plunged into darkness, except for the pale, silvery moonlight filtering through the tall windows. They had started the game, the one their parents had forbidden. And now, I was the seeker. The house no longer felt just old, it felt evil. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and twist. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaken as I turned on its flashlight. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, making everything outside its circle look even blacker. As I swept the light across the floor, it landed on a small piece of folded paper. It was a note written in red crayon. Rule number 1. Find us before the clock strikes midnight. I glanced at my phone. It was 11:40 p.m. I had 20 minutes. I had to find them. The game was no longer a game, it was a race. I started searching, my flashlight beam dancing nervously around the empty rooms. The silence was broken by faint whispers that I could never quite locate. Sometimes it sounded like a child's whisper from the room next door. Other times it sounded like a dry, rustling voice from right behind me. In the downstairs library, I found another note placed on a dusty book. Rule number 2. Don't look in the mirrors. A chill went down my spine. The house was full of them. Large, ornate mirrors with dark, gilded frames hung in every hallway and room. I made a conscious effort not to look at my reflection as I searched. I heard a floorboard creak in the dining room and rushed in, hoping to find one of them. The room was empty, but a long, heavy curtain swayed slightly, as if someone had just hidden behind it. I pulled the curtain back. Leo was huddled there, his small body trembling. He wasn't smiling. His face was pale with genuine terror. "I found you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where's your sister?" He looked up at me, his eyes wide. "You have to find Lily," he whispered, his voice trembling. "He's helping her hide. He's better at it than we are." "Who's helping her, Leo?" "Who are you talking about?" He didn't answer. He just lifted a shaky finger and pointed toward the dark staircase leading to the second floor. My blood ran cold. I took Leo's hand and led him to the brightly lit kitchen, telling him to stay put. I had to go find his sister. As I started up the stairs, the old grandfather clock in the foyer began to chime. It was midnight. I had failed rule number 1. The house suddenly felt colder. The air grew thick and heavy. I knew I had broken the rules of the game. Now I had no idea what the penalty was. Upstairs, I heard a soft, melodic humming coming from the end of the hall. It was coming from the master bedroom, a room the parents had told me was off limits. The door was slightly open. I knew Lily had to be in there. With my heart hammering against my ribs, I pushed the door open. The room was lined with mirrors. The wardrobe doors were mirrors. A full-length mirror stood in the corner, and a massive vanity mirror dominated the far wall. I had just broken rule number 2, and in the center of the room, I saw her. Lily was standing with her back to me, staring at her own reflection in the vanity. She was the one who was humming. "Lily," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "the game's over. We have to go." She didn't move. She just kept humming that strange little tune. But her reflection did move. It slowly turned its head to look at me, even though the real Lily hadn't moved an inch. The reflection smiled, a horrifyingly wide smile that stretched its face into an impossible shape. Its eyes were 2 pits of solid black. The reflection raised a single finger to its lips in a shushing motion. Then the real Lily stopped humming. She turned around slowly, her face a mask of pure terror. "You didn't find me in time," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Now you have to play with him." And then I saw it. In the vanity mirror, behind the grinning reflection of Lily, something was emerging. A tall, shadowy figure seemed to be unfolding itself from the darkness within the glass. It wasn't a reflection of anything in the room. It was something else, something that was coming out. I didn't wait to see its face. I screamed, a raw, terrified sound that tore from my throat. I turned and ran. I fled down the stairs, grabbed a silent, staring Leo from the kitchen, and burst out the front door into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until we were in my car. As I fumbled with the keys, I glanced back at the house. A light was on in the master bedroom window. A tall, slender silhouette was standing there, perfectly still, watching me. I never got my last $100. The Delacourts called me the next day, their voices calm and even. They thanked me for my time and said they would mail a check. They never mentioned the game. They never asked why I had fled their home in terror. It was as if nothing had happened. But something did happen. The game never ended for me. Sometimes, late at night, when I walk past a mirror or a dark window, I see it. A flicker of movement in my reflection. A shadow that's a little too tall, a little too thin. I always feel like I'm being watched, like I'm still the seeker in a game that I can never win. I'm always waiting for a whisper in the dark, telling me, "Ready or not, here I come." My name is Ethan Grant. I was 19, taking a gap year before college and working whatever odd jobs I could find. Babysitting wasn't my first choice, but when my mom's friend, Mrs. Gable, needed someone to watch her 7-year-old son, Noah, for a weekend, the pay was too good to pass up. I had been a camp counselor for 3 summers, so I knew my way around kids. I figured a weekend with one 7-year-old would be easy. But Noah wasn't like the kids at camp, and the thing he carried with him wasn't a toy. It was a doorway. and that weekend I watched in horror as something from the other side started to crawl through. The Gables' house was completely normal. It was a nice 2-story house in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac. Mrs. Gable was warm and friendly. She showed me where everything was, rattling off Noah's schedule. He was a sweet-looking kid with big brown eyes and a shy smile. He was clinging to a strange-looking doll. It was a homemade thing, stitched together from mismatched pieces of faded burlap. It had black buttons for eyes and a crudely drawn smile in red thread. It was the kind of doll that was more creepy than cute. "That's Patches," Mrs. Gable said with a tired sigh. "Noah takes him everywhere. He won't sleep without him." She leaned in closer and lowered her voice. "Honestly, I hate the thing. My husband's grandmother made it years ago. It gives me the creeps. But Noah loves him." She explained that they were going out of town for her sister's wedding and would be back Sunday evening. Before she left, she gave me one last instruction. "Noah talks to Patches a lot," she said, her smile looking a little forced. "He has a very active imagination. He might say that Patches talks back. Just play along with it, okay? It's just a phase." I said I understood. I'd dealt with kids with imaginary friends before. It didn't seem like a big deal. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. Noah and I played video games, built a huge fort out of blankets in the living room, and ate pizza for dinner. He was a great kid, fun and energetic. The whole time, the Patches doll sat on the couch, its button eyes seeming to watch our every move. The first strange thing happened after I put Noah to bed. I was cleaning up the pizza boxes in the kitchen when I heard a soft thump from the living room. I went to check it out. The Patches doll, which had been sitting upright on the couch, was now lying face down on the floor in the middle of the room. I figured it had just fallen. I picked it up and put it back on the couch, propping it against a cushion. I turned to go back to the kitchen, and I heard another soft thump. I turned back around. The doll was on the floor again, in the exact same spot. I stared at it, my skin prickling. There was no way it could have fallen twice in the same way. It was just a doll. It couldn't move. I told myself I was just tired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. I picked it up again, but this time I didn't put it back on the couch. I took it upstairs and placed it on the dresser in Noah's room, as far from his bed as I could get it. He was fast asleep. I closed his door quietly and went back downstairs, feeling uneasy. Later that night, I was watching a movie when I heard a voice. It was a faint whisper, and it was coming from the baby monitor Mrs. Gable had left on the coffee table. I turned the movie's volume down and listened. It was Noah talking in his sleep. "No, I don't want to," he murmured. There was a pause, and then another voice answered. It was a low, raspy sound, like sandpaper on wood. It was quiet, but the words were clear. "You have to. It's the only way he will open his eyes." My heart stopped. There was someone in the room with Noah. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a metal fireplace poker, and crept up the stairs. My mind was racing. Was there an intruder? Did someone get in through a window? I slowly pushed Noah's bedroom door open, ready to confront whoever was inside. The room was empty, except for Noah, who was tossing and turning in his bed, tangled in his sheets. I checked the closet. I looked under the bed. No one was there. I was about to dismiss it as a dream when my eyes fell on the dresser. The Patches doll was gone. I looked over at Noah's bed. The doll was there, tucked tightly under Noah's arm. Its button eyes seemed to gleam in the dim light from the hallway. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on the couch, staring at the baby monitor, listening to the static. The next day, Noah was quiet and withdrawn. He didn't want to play video games. He just wanted to sit in his room and talk to Patches. I tried to get him to come outside, but he refused. "Patches doesn't like the sun," he said in a small voice. "He says it hurts his new eyes." That afternoon, I was in the kitchen making us sandwiches when I heard Noah start to cry. I ran upstairs. He was sitting on his bed, holding the doll and sobbing. "What's wrong, Noah?" I asked, sitting beside him. He held up the doll. "Patches is hungry," he cried. "He says if I don't feed him, he'll go away forever." "What does he want to eat?" I asked, trying to play along like his mom said. I figured I'd get him a cookie or something. Noah looked up at me, his face pale and his eyes full of fear. "He wants something warm," he whispered. "Something red." A wave of pure dread washed over me. This was not a normal imaginary friend. This was something else. I took the doll from him. "Noah," I said, my voice firm, "Patches is just a doll. He can't talk and he doesn't get hungry." Noah's face crumpled and he started to wail. But underneath his cries, I heard another sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the doll in my hands. I swear I felt it vibrate. The red thread smile on its face seemed to stretch, to widen into a hungry snarl. I threw the doll across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud and fell to the floor. That night, things got worse. I put Noah to bed, but I kept the doll downstairs with me. I locked it in a kitchen cabinet. I was not going to let that thing near him again. Around 2 a.m., I was startled awake by a loud crash from upstairs. I bolted up the stairs and into Noah's room. The room was a wreck. His bookshelf was overturned and his toys were scattered everywhere. Noah was standing in the middle of the room, his back to me. He was perfectly still. "Noah?" I said, my voice trembling. He turned around slowly. His eyes were wide open, but they were completely black. There was no white, no iris, just two empty, dark voids, and he was smiling. A wide, unnatural smile that didn't belong on his face. "He's here," Noah said, but the voice that came out of his mouth wasn't his. It was the low, raspy voice from the baby monitor, the voice of Patches. "I told you I was hungry." My body went into fight or flight mode. I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed Noah's arm and pulled him out of the room, slamming the door shut behind us. I ran down the stairs, scooped Noah into my arms, and didn't stop until we were outside. I got us both in my car and locked the doors. Noah was silent now, his head lolling against my shoulder as if he were asleep. But when I looked at his face in the dim light of the dashboard, his eyes were still open, and they were still black. I called his parents. I called 911. I told them there was an intruder, that Noah wasn't safe. When the police arrived, they went into the house. They found nothing. No one was there. When they brought Noah out, he was crying, but his eyes were back to normal. He kept asking for Patches. The Gables came home early. They were furious with me. They said I had overreacted, that I had terrified their son. They told me to leave and that I would not be paid. As I walked to my car, defeated and confused, Mr. Gable stopped me. His face was grim. He pressed a wad of cash into my hand. "Just forget this ever happened," he said in a low voice. "Some things, they're attached to families. You don't want this one attached to you." I took the money and I left. I never saw them again. But I can't forget. I still have nightmares about Noah's black eyes and that awful, raspy voice coming from a child's mouth. I see that burlap doll with its button eyes and its red thread smile. I know that thing wasn't a toy. It was a vessel, and it was hungry. I just pray that whatever it was, it stayed with that family, because I know, deep in my soul, that it's still looking for something warm and red to eat. My name is Robert Sterling. I used to be a teacher for a long time, then I retired. To keep busy and make a little extra money, I started babysitting. I thought I'd seen it all when it came to kids and their mischief. I was pretty good at understanding them, even the difficult ones. But nothing, not all my years in the classroom, prepared me for the Thompson house. It was a place where children kept a secret, a very old and very hungry secret that should never have been found. This job, with Sarah and Michael, showed me that some people aren't just protecting their children. They're protecting what their children keep. It was a cold, damp weekend in late autumn. The Thompson house was deep in the woods, far from any town. It was a big, old place, 3 stories, with dark wood and a neglected garden. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson were going away for the whole weekend. They had 2 children, Sarah, who was 12, and Michael, 10. The parents were very hurried when they left, giving me quick instructions. "The kids know the rules," Mr. Thompson said, not meeting my eyes. "Just keep them fed. And don't go near the attic door upstairs. It's locked for repairs." Sarah and Michael stood by the fireplace, quiet, observant. Their eyes seemed a little too old, a little too knowing for their faces. They just watched their parents leave, then watched me. The house was cold, despite the fire in the living room. It smelled of damp leaves and old wood. The children didn't say much. They played board games by themselves, rarely looking up. I tried to talk to them, ask about school, but they just gave short answers. I cooked dinner, and they ate quietly. Everything seemed normal, but it was an unsettling normal. The quiet felt heavy, like a blanket. The air was still, and the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the wind sighing outside. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel alone, even when you're not. I told myself it was just a big old house and quiet kids. Around 10, after the children were in their rooms, I heard it. A faint scratching sound. It came from upstairs, from the 3rd floor, near where the Thompsons said the attic door was. It was soft at first, like something tiny dragging its claws across wood. I froze, listening. It stopped. I waited. Nothing. I tried to rationalize it. Old house, mice in the walls, maybe a branch scraping the roof. It was deep in the woods after all. Then, a few minutes later, it started again. This time, it was more defined, a rhythmic tap-tap scratch, directly from behind that locked door. It wasn't a mouse. It was too deliberate, and it sounded like it was coming from inside the locked room. My heart gave a small jump. I walked to the bottom of the stairs, peering up. The 3rd floor hallway was dark. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding weak in the big house. The scratching stopped immediately. Silence. A strange, unsettling feeling started to crawl up my spine. Had one of the kids gone up there? Were they trying to scare me? My instincts told me this was more than a prank. The atmosphere in the house was growing thicker, colder. The next morning, I found a drawing on the kitchen table. It was made with dark crayons. It showed a creature, grotesque and impossible, with many long, thin limbs and a lump for a head. It had large, empty eyes, and next to it, written in clumsy child's handwriting, were the words, "It's hungry." I stared at the drawing. It was far too detailed, too disturbing for a child to draw normally. It looked like something from a nightmare, but drawn with great care. I felt a knot of dread in my stomach. Later that day, I found another drawing, this one in the living room propped up against a vase. It was the same creature, but this time it was reaching out with its many limbs towards a stick figure. Underneath it was written, "Feed it." I asked Sarah and Michael about the drawings. They just shrugged, their faces blank. "Just something we thought of," Sarah said. Michael gave a small, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's our pet," he said, too casually. The scratching from the attic door grew more insistent that night. It wasn't just scratching now. There was a low, guttural moan, a soft, wet sound coming from behind that door. It sounded like something in pain, or something hungry. And then I started noticing other things. Small, crude altars made of twigs and stones in the corners of Sarah and Michael's rooms. And once, I saw Michael leaving a small raw piece of meat on a plate near the base of the stairs, then quickly walking away when he saw me. "For our pet," he said when I asked, that unsettling smile on his face again. "It gets hungry at night." My suspicion turned to a cold, hard certainty that something was very, very wrong. I tried to ask them again about the door, about their pet, but they just giggled, a sound that sent chills down my spine. They were hiding something, and it was something truly terrifying. It was deep into Saturday night. The children were supposedly asleep, but the sounds from the attic door were no longer just scratching or moaning. Now, there was a frantic, desperate banging, like something large and heavy was throwing itself against the inside of the door. A sickeningly sweet smell, like decay and fresh blood, seeped from under the door, filling the upper floor with its putrid odor. My heart was pounding. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Curiosity, mixed with a paralyzing fear, pushed me forward. I had to know what was in that room. I remembered Mr. Thompson's strange glance when he mentioned the locked door. I started searching for a key. I looked in obvious places, then less obvious ones. Finally, hidden under a loose floorboard in the hallway, exactly where Michael had accidentally kicked it the day before, was a small, tarnished silver key. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. This was it. No turning back. I walked to the attic door. The banging was almost constant now, a horrible, wet thudding. The door itself was old with peeling paint and dark stains around the lock. I inserted the key, turned it. The lock clicked open with a loud, final sound. I took a deep, shaky breath and slowly, carefully pushed the door open. The room was completely dark, save for the faint light from the hallway. It was an attic, but it was empty. Nothing but dust and shadows. But in the very center, bathed in the faint light filtering through the doorway, was a large, rough-hewn wooden cage. It was old, stained with something dark and sticky, and inside the cage, a nightmare writhed. It was a pulsing, dark mass of glistening tendrils and raw, exposed flesh. It was vaguely humanoid, but twisted, grotesque, with too many limbs that flailed silently, searching. It had no discernible head, just a central pulsing mass of dark, wet tissue. A constant, low moaning sound, like something in unending agony, came from it. The smell of decay and fresh blood was overwhelming, making me gag. I stared, paralyzed by horror, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't human. It was an abomination. As I watched, two glowing yellow eyes slowly opened on the mass, embedded deep within its pulsing form. They were large, cat-like, and ancient. It let out a wet, slithering sound, a horrific gurgle of anticipation. And then, from behind me, two quiet voices. "You found it!" I spun around, heart rocketing into my throat. Sarah and Michael stood in the doorway of the attic, blocking my escape. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on me, and on their faces were identical, unnerving smiles. They weren't the smiles of children. They were predatory, cold. "Now it's time for its dinner," Michael said, his voice flat, devoid of any childish emotion. And Sarah slowly, deliberately, held up a small sharp knife. It gleamed wickedly in the dim light. Pure, unadulterated terror seized me. I didn't think. I screamed, a raw, desperate sound, and shoved past the children, bursting out of the attic and down the stairs. Their laughter, a cold, echoing sound, followed me. I didn't look back. I just ran, my legs burning, until I was out of the house, into the cold, damp woods. I didn't stop until I reached my car and drove away, leaving the monstrous secret and its keepers behind. I reported it, of course. The police went to the Thompson house. They found it empty. No cage, no creature, no sign of Sarah or Michael. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson were unreachable, their phones disconnected. They were just gone. The house stood silent, empty in the woods. I quit babysitting after that. I couldn't face another child's room. I became reclusive. The memory of that writhing mass and the children's silent, predatory smiles burned into my mind. I still have nightmares of those yellow eyes and the wet, slithering sound. I wonder if they were ever truly children, or if they were something else, guarding a secret that should never have been seen. And I know, with absolute certainty, that they are still out there, those children and their hungry pet, and they are always looking for dinner. My name is Clara Rossi. I worked as a live-in nanny for a few years, mostly for wealthy families who traveled a lot. It seemed like a dream job, seeing different places, being part of these grand households, but I learned quickly that luxury doesn't always mean safety. Sometimes, the bigger the house, the deeper the secrets. The Sterling estate was one of those places. It showed me that some families keep more than just heirlooms in their grand old homes. They keep a presence, something ancient, and it waits for the children to invite it in. This job, with young Emily Sterling, was the one that taught me that some playdates are not with friends you can see. It was a sprawling, old estate on the coast of Maine. Fog often rolled in from the ocean, giving everything a ghostly, soft look. The Sterling family was rarely home, always traveling. Their daughter, 10-year-old Emily, was left in my care for months at a time. She was a quiet, thoughtful girl who loved to read and draw. The house was huge, filled with antique furniture and dark portraits. Mr. and Mrs. Sterling had given me minimal instructions, mostly about Emily's schedule and the house's alarm system. "Emily is a good child," Mrs. Sterling had said, her voice a little too light. "She just plays by herself a lot." They left in a hurry, their expensive car disappearing into the misty driveway. The first few weeks were peaceful, if a bit lonely. Emily spent her days reading in the library or drawing in her room. The house was usually silent, except for the distant cry of gulls and the mournful sound of the foghorn. It was the kind of quiet that echoed, making every small sound seem louder. I found myself listening intently, even when there was nothing to hear. I told myself it was just the isolation, the vastness of the house. About a month into my stay, I started noticing strange things. Emily would often be in her room, talking, not talking to me, but to someone else. "No, don't break that. You know I like it," I'd hear her say. Or, "You can't sit there. That's my spot." She was always talking to an empty chair or a blank space in the room. I thought she had an imaginary friend, which was normal for a lonely child. But the way she talked, her tone, sounded less like playful imagination and more like genuine frustration, sometimes even fear. Her face would be pale, her brow furrowed, as if she was arguing with someone very real. I tried to ask her, gently, "Who are you talking to, Emily?" She'd look up, her eyes wide. "Just my friend," she'd say, then quickly change the subject. I tried to rationalize it. A lonely child's imagination can be very powerful. It was nothing to worry about. But the oddities continued to grow. Sometimes I would walk past Emily's room and see toys moving by themselves. A doll would be pulled across the floor, or a book would slide off her shelf. Once, I saw her prized porcelain doll, sitting on a high shelf, slowly turn its head to face me as I walked by. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, and it was facing forward again, just my imagination, playing tricks on me in the quiet, old house. I told myself I was probably tired or seeing things in the dim light. Then, one afternoon, I found a collection of Emily's drawings. She was usually very neat, very artistic, but these drawings were different. They were made with dark, thick charcoal. They showed a figure, tall and gaunt, with long, stringy hair and eyes that were just black holes. It was always standing behind Emily in the drawings, sometimes reaching for her. And in some of the pictures it was holding a large, ornate key. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a whimsical imaginary friend. This was something truly disturbing. I asked Emily about the drawings. Her face went pale. "He makes me draw them," she whispered, her eyes darting to the corner of the room, as if something was standing there. "He likes it." A few nights later, I woke up to Emily screaming, a blood-curdling, terrified shriek that ripped through the quiet house. I shot out of bed and ran to her room. The door was wide open, and the room was bathed in the eerie glow of the moonlight. Emily was sitting up in bed, huddled in a ball, trembling violently. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the closed closet door. "He was here," she sobbed. "He was looking at me." And he had his key. I hugged her tightly, trying to soothe her, but my eyes were on that closet door. It was an old, heavy wooden door with an antique lock that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Now, a faint, metallic clang seemed to come from it, a soft, scraping sound, as if something was being turned in the lock from the inside. And from the cracks around the door, a faint, sickly sweet smell, like dried roses and dust, started to seep into the room. My instincts were screaming at me. This wasn't a child's nightmare. This was real. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Just an old house, old sounds. But the metallic clang grew louder, more insistent, like someone was trying to force a heavy lock. And the smell of dried roses and dust, which also carried a faint, coppery scent, became overpowering, making my head spin. I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that something was in that closet. Something had been there for a long time, and Emily's drawings, her terror, the sounds, it all meant it was trying to get out. I held Emily tightly, trying to shield her, but my eyes kept darting to the closet door. The metallic scraping stopped. Then, with a soft, ominous click, the heavy antique lock disengaged. My breath caught in my throat. The door, slowly, silently, began to creak open. Darkness, a profound, unyielding blackness, seemed to pour from the crack, filling the room with an unnatural chill. I could see nothing inside, just an abyss. But then, 2 points of light, small and intensely red, appeared in the deepest part of that darkness. They were like embers, glowing with a malevolent light, and they were fixed on Emily. As the eyes appeared, a low, rasping whisper, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, filled the room. It wasn't speaking words I could understand, but the intent was clear. It wanted Emily. It was hungry for her. My blood ran cold. This wasn't Emily's imaginary friend. This was a predator, an entity of pure malice. I clutched Emily tighter, ready to run, to scream. But Emily, instead of screaming, slowly lifted her hand. In her small fingers, she held a large, ornate, antique key. It was identical to the one in her drawings. Her eyes, wide and glassy, were fixed on the red, glowing eyes in the closet. "He gave it to me," she whispered, her voice sounding oddly distant, disconnected. "He wants me to open it." Then she slowly, deliberately, began to rise from the bed, still holding the key. Her movements were stiff, unnatural, like she was being pulled by invisible strings. Her eyes were blank, fixed on the closet. She was walking towards the darkness, towards the glowing red eyes. "Emily, no!" I screamed, pulling on her, trying to stop her, but her small body felt impossibly heavy, strong. She was walking like a sleepwalker, compelled by some unseen force. As Emily reached the closet door, the glowing red eyes widened. The rasping whisper grew louder, more guttural, a sound of triumph. Emily, with her unseeing eyes, lifted the key and slowly, perfectly, inserted it into the old, empty keyhole of the now unlocked closet door. She turned it with a soft click, and then the door swung wide open, revealing the abyssal darkness within. From the blackness, a single, impossibly long, pale, bony finger slowly extended, reaching for Emily. It was too long to be human, too thin, tipped with a black, cracked nail. It wrapped around Emily's wrist. Emily didn't resist. She didn't even flinch. She just let herself be pulled, slowly, into the overwhelming darkness of the closet. I screamed again, a raw, primal sound of pure horror. I tried to pull Emily back, to fight against the unseen force dragging her, but it was too strong. My fingers slipped from her arm. The last thing I saw before the closet door slammed shut was Emily's face, her eyes still blank, her body disappearing into the black. The metallic clang of the lock, engaging itself, echoed through the suddenly silent room. And then, a faint, high-pitched giggle, filled with ancient, chilling glee, came from behind the now-closed closet door. I collapsed to the floor, shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down my face. I was trapped in that room, that house, with the echo of that giggle and the memory of Emily's vacant eyes. I didn't know what to do. I just huddled there, paralyzed by fear, until the sun finally rose, casting its weak morning light into the room. I never saw Emily again. The Sterling parents came home days later, found the house empty, found me a hysterical mess on the floor. They called the police. They searched everywhere. No sign of Emily. No sign of anything in the closet. Just old clothes and empty hangers. They thought I had lost my mind, that I had hurt Emily. I was questioned for weeks, my life turned upside down, but they could never prove anything. The memory of that night, of Emily's blank eyes and that impossibly long finger, haunts my every waking moment. I see those red eyes in the dark. I hear that dry, rasping whisper in the wind. I see the key, always the key, a symbol of what she opened, what she allowed in. I never babysat again. I can't even look at children without feeling a knot of dread. I wonder what they truly see, what they invite into their lonely worlds. And I often wonder, late at night, if Emily is still in that closet, or if she became a part of what was inside waiting for another lonely child to find the key. My name is Marcus Thorne. I used to be a caretaker for a large property management company. My job involved looking after vacant homes, making sure they were ready for new tenants or owners. It was usually quiet work, checking on plumbing, electrical, making sure no squatters moved in. But some houses, even when empty, are not truly vacant. They hold on to something. The old Blackwood Manor was one of those places. It taught me that some houses are not just built with bricks and mortar, but with history, and sometimes with silent, watchful residents who don't want to leave. This job at Blackwood Manor was the one that showed me that children aren't always the only ones being watched. Blackwood Manor was an imposing, Gothic-looking house on the edge of town, surrounded by tall, ancient trees. It had been empty for years, its previous owners having vanished mysteriously. The company wanted to renovate it for sale. My job was to do weekly checks, make sure everything was in order, and generally keep an eye on the place. The first time I stepped inside, the air was thick with dust and the heavy scent of decay, mixed with something metallic, like old blood. The windows were boarded up, leaving the interior in perpetual twilight. It felt wrong, even then. It felt like a tomb. My first few weeks of checks were uneventful, but deeply unsettling. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind rattling the boarded windows made me jump. The quiet was profound, broken only by my own footsteps and the distant caw of crows. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring, a silence that felt like it was listening. I told myself it was just an old, empty house, playing tricks on my nerves. About a month in, I started noticing things that weren't quite right. I'd leave a tool in one room, only to find it in another. A newspaper I'd put on a table would be neatly folded and placed on a different chair. At first, I thought it was just me forgetting, or maybe a draft. But then, I started seeing small, dirty footprints on the dusty floorboards. They were child-sized, too small to be mine, too distinct to be a trick of the light. I'd clean them up, only for them to reappear the next week. I started to feel like I wasn't alone. I reported it to my boss, suggesting maybe a local kid was sneaking in. He just laughed it off, said it was an old house. My instincts, though, were screaming that something was wrong. The air in the certain rooms felt impossibly cold, even in summer, and sometimes I'd catch a faint, fleeting smell of something sweet and artificial, like cotton candy, mixed with something rancid, like sour milk. It was unsettling. Once, I found a child's crude drawing on the dusty floor in the main hall. It was a stick figure, holding hands with a larger, shadowy figure. The shadowy figure had no face, just empty space. It was childlike but deeply disturbing, like a child's hand trying to draw something it shouldn't be seeing. One afternoon, I was walking through the house, checking the windows when I heard it. A faint, almost inaudible giggle. It was a child's giggle, light and playful, but it echoed eerily in the empty house. It seemed to come from upstairs. My heart pounded. I froze, listening. Nothing. I waited, holding my breath. Then a small, distinct thump, like a ball bouncing softly, came from the same direction. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that there was a child, or children, in this supposedly empty house. I slowly walked up the grand staircase, my hand on the dusty railing. The giggle sounded again, a little louder, coming from the end of the long, dark hallway upstairs. It sounded like it was coming from the master bedroom. I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. It was cold to the touch. I slowly pushed it open. The master bedroom was large, filled with shadows. The windows were still boarded up, letting in only slivers of light. There was no child there. But in the center of the room, lying on the dusty floor, was a single, brightly colored rubber ball. It was one of those old-fashioned ones, striped red and yellow. It looked perfectly clean, almost new, standing out starkly against the grime of the room. As I stared at it, the ball slowly, subtly, rolled a few inches to the left. Then it stopped. My blood ran cold. My mind tried to rationalize it. A draft, the floor isn't level, but the house was still, the air unmoving. And then another faint giggle, this time much closer, almost right next to my ear. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there. Just empty air. The smell of cotton candy and sour milk was strong now, making my stomach churn. Then I heard a new sound. A soft, wet plink, plink, coming from the corner of the room, near a large, ornate vanity table. It sounded like something dripping. I moved towards it, slowly, cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. As I got closer, the dripping sound became clearer. It wasn't water, it was thicker, more viscous. And then I saw it. On the vanity table, amidst the dust and cobwebs, was an old, tarnished silver music box. It was open, and from its small metal ballerina, instead of music, a thick, dark red liquid was slowly dripping onto the polished wood of the table. It looked like blood, fresh blood. And from inside the open music box, I heard a faint, tiny voice, distorted and high-pitched, like a broken music box playing a child's cry. "Play with us," it whispered. "Play with us forever." My mind shattered. The ball, the giggles, the footprints, the drawings, and now this. This wasn't just kids. This was something ancient, something evil. It was using the guise of children to lure me, to play its game. I screamed, a raw, terrified sound. I didn't stop to think, didn't try to close the music box, didn't try to look for the source of the voice. I just turned and ran, stumbling out of the room, down the stairs and out the front door, leaving it wide open. I didn't stop until I was in my car, shaking, sobbing, my hands clenched so tight on the steering wheel my knuckles were white. I drove away from Blackwood Manor that day and never went back. I quit my job, gave up property management. I tried to explain what I saw, what I heard, but no one believed me. They said the house was empty. They said I was stressed, overworked. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I still hear those faint giggles sometimes, especially when it's quiet. I still smell that sickly sweet cotton candy and sour milk when I least expect it. I see those little footprints in my mind, and I know, with absolute certainty, that some houses are not just empty. They are waiting for someone to come inside, someone to play. And the children in Blackwood Manor are still there, still playing, forever. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I used to be a very successful, highly sought-after overnight nurse for children with special needs. It was demanding work, but incredibly rewarding. I saw a lot of different family situations, from the struggling to the wealthy, and I learned that sometimes the most vulnerable among us can also be the most perceptive. The Chambers family home, with its perfect facade and quiet child, taught me that not all illnesses are physical and not all sounds are audible to everyone. This job with young Thomas Chambers was the one that revealed to me that some children are not just sick. They are burdened with a presence that wants to keep them for itself. The Chambers family lived in a beautiful, modern home in a very exclusive neighborhood. They had one child, 8-year-old Thomas, who was nonverbal and confined to a wheelchair due to a rare neurological condition. My job was to stay with him overnight, monitor his vital signs, and provide any care he needed. Mr. and Mrs. Chambers were very kind, very grateful for my help. Thomas is a sweet boy, Mrs. Chambers told me, her eyes a little too sad. He just has trouble communicating, but he's very aware. They gave me his medication schedule, emergency contacts, and then left for a weekend trip, leaving me alone with Thomas. The first night was quiet. Thomas slept peacefully in his room, which was equipped with all sorts of medical devices that hummed softly. The house was clean, minimalist, almost sterile. It was the kind of quiet where you could hear your own heartbeat. I kept an eye on Thomas, read a book, and tried to settle into the routine. It felt calm, but a little too still, like a held breath. I told myself it was just the unusual situation, being in such a quiet, unfamiliar home. Around midnight, I started noticing things that unsettled me. Thomas was in his bed, seemingly asleep, but his eyes, though closed, seemed to flutter rapidly, as if he was experiencing an intense dream, and his head would subtly, almost imperceptibly, turn towards the darkest corner of his room. It was too slight to be a conscious movement, more like a magnetic pull. I checked his monitors. Everything was normal. I tried to dismiss it as a symptom of his condition, or perhaps just a bad dream. But the subtle turning of his head continued, even when his body was completely relaxed. My instincts started to prickle. The air in Thomas's room felt heavy and strangely cold, even with the heating on. Sometimes I would catch a fleeting metallic scent, like old blood mixed with something sweet, like sickly sweet candy. It was very faint, but always there when Thomas's head turned to that corner. Once I saw Thomas's hand, lying limply on his bed, slowly clench into a fist, then release over and over as if he was struggling with something unseen. I tried to ask him, "Thomas, is everything all right?" Of course, he couldn't answer verbally, but his eyes, when they finally opened, were wide with a terror that I couldn't explain. He looked at me, then at the corner, then back at me as if begging for help. Then, one evening, I found a series of drawings that Thomas had made. He usually drew simple shapes or lines, but these were different. They were made with thick, dark charcoal on large sheets of paper. They showed a figure, tall and gaunt, with long, thin limbs and a head that was just a shadowy blur. It had 2 glowing red dots where its eyes should be, and in every drawing, it was standing right beside a small, wheelchair-bound stick figure, its long arm wrapped around the stick figure's shoulder. The drawings were deeply disturbing, far too precise, far too clear for a child with his condition. It looked like he was drawing exactly what he was seeing. The air in Thomas's room grew colder, denser, especially when his head turned towards that specific corner. The metallic, sweet smell became more noticeable, making my stomach churn. One night, I was watching Thomas sleep when I heard a faint, high-pitched scratching sound. It was coming from the corner of the room, exactly where Thomas always seemed to be looking. It wasn't loud, but it was insistent, like something trying to dig its way through the wall. And then, a low, guttural growl, a sound that wasn't human, vibrated through the floorboards. It was almost inaudible, but I felt it, a deep thrum in my chest. My heart hammered in my chest. This wasn't a nightmare. This was real. I tried to tell myself it was the old house settling or sounds from outside, but the growl felt too close, too deliberate, and Thomas's eyes, wide open now, were fixed on that corner, his mouth open in a silent scream. His whole body was trembling violently. I knew, with chilling certainty, that whatever was making those sounds whatever was in that corner was real, and Thomas was terrified of it. I slowly stood up, my eyes fixed on the corner. The scratching intensified, becoming more frantic, more desperate. The metallic, sweet smell was now overwhelming, making me lightheaded. I could feel a tangible coldness radiating from that spot, like a freezer door had been left open. "Thomas, what do you see?" I whispered, even though I knew he couldn't answer. He just stared, his eyes pleading. Suddenly, a section of the wallpaper in the corner began to bubble, to tear. Slowly, a dark, viscous liquid started to seep from the tear, smelling strongly of iron and sweet decay. And then, from the tear, a faint, almost transparent hand started to emerge. It was impossibly thin, its skin stretched taut over skeletal fingers, tipped with long, black nails. It was reaching, slowly, deliberately, for Thomas. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a shadow or a sound. This was a physical manifestation of something utterly evil. I screamed, a raw, terrified sound. I grabbed Thomas's wheelchair, trying to pull him away, to move him from the bed, from the reaching hand. But, as I pulled, Thomas let out a choked sound, a guttural gasp that was the closest thing to a scream I had ever heard from him. His eyes, fixed on the corner, were filled with agonizing fear. Then, the hand, now fully emerged, its skin glistening with the dark liquid, reached for Thomas. It wrapped its long, skeletal fingers around his arm. Thomas convulsed, his body arching in an unnatural way, as if in immense pain. His silent scream was agonizing to witness. And then, a voice, deep and ancient, filled the room. It wasn't spoken aloud, but echoed inside my mind, a chilling whisper that froze my very soul. "He is ours. Forever." My mind shattered. The evil in that voice, the force dragging Thomas, was too much. I was pulling on his wheelchair with all my might, but it was like trying to pull against a brick wall. The hand was pulling him, slowly but surely, towards the wall, towards the tearing wallpaper, towards the abyssal darkness behind it. Thomas was crying now, tears streaming silently down his face, his body still convulsing. I could feel the cold radiating from the wall, a physical pain. Then, with a sickening rip, the wallpaper tore further. The darkness behind it was not a wall. It was a void, a black, swirling vortex. The hand pulled Thomas harder. His small, frail body was being stretched, pulled into the blackness. I screamed again, a desperate, hopeless sound, as I felt his arm slip from my grasp. The last thing I saw was Thomas's face, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a soundless shriek, as he was slowly, agonizingly, pulled into the swirling darkness behind the wall. The wallpaper then slowly, sickeningly, began to close itself, sealing the tear, leaving only a faint stain of the dark liquid. The room fell silent. I collapsed to the floor, shaking uncontrollably, sobbing, unable to comprehend what I had just witnessed. I huddled there, my body numb with terror, until the first rays of dawn finally broke through the window. I never saw Thomas again. The Chambers' parents came home. They found me a hysterical mess, Thomas's room empty, no signs of forced entry, no tearing wallpaper, no dark liquid. The room was immaculate. They thought I had snapped, that I'd kidnapped or harmed their son. I was arrested, questioned for months, almost lost my license. But there was no evidence. Thomas was just gone. No trace. But the horror, the memory of that night, lives with me every single day. I still see that skeletal hand stretching from the wall, its long fingers pulling Thomas into the void. I still hear that silent scream. I feel that cold, ancient whisper in my mind. I see the drawings of the gaunt figure, and I know it was real. I quit nursing. I couldn't be around children again, especially sick ones. I look at every wall, every dark corner, and I wonder what lies behind them, what waits for the vulnerable. And I know with absolute certainty that some children are not just sick. They are chosen, taken, and held forever by something ancient that exists just beyond our sight. My name is Daniel Evans. I spent a few years working as a security guard for high-end residential properties. It was a pretty cushy job, mostly patrolling empty estates, making sure no one broke in. You think these big, empty houses are safe, right? Just quiet, waiting for their owners to come home. But some places, even with all their security, hold secrets far deeper than any vault. The Thorne Estate was one of those places. It taught me that sometimes the things you're guarding aren't just property. They're souls, or worse, the echoes of them, still trapped and waiting to play. This particular job at the Thorne Estate showed me that children are not always innocent, and sometimes they play games even after death. The Thorne Estate was massive, a sprawling complex of buildings and manicured gardens. The family had gone on an extended vacation, leaving me in charge of the main house. It was full of expensive art, antique furniture, and state-of-the-art security systems. My job was simple: patrol the perimeter, check the house every few hours, and make sure everything was locked down tight. The house itself felt cold, impersonal, almost like a museum. It smelled of old money and polish, but under that, a faint, musty scent lingered like a forgotten basement. My first few weeks were routine. I walked the grounds, checked the doors, glanced at the cameras. The house was always silent, always still. The quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the hum of the alarm systems and my own footsteps. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel watched, even when you knew you were alone. I told myself it was just the vastness of the place, the emptiness. About a month into the job, I started noticing anomalies. Lights would flicker in rooms where they shouldn't be on. Doors I knew I'd locked would be slightly ajar. At first, I blamed the old wiring, or maybe a faulty lock. But then, I started finding toys in strange places. A small, porcelain doll would be sitting on a grand piano. A child's wooden train would be laid out on the pristine dining table. I knew the Thorne family had no young children, only grown adults. I reported it, thinking maybe a squatter had found a way in, but my boss insisted the house was secure. My instincts, though, were screaming that something was wrong. The air in the certain areas of the house felt impossibly cold, even in summer, and sometimes I'd catch a faint, fleeting smell of something sweet, like old candy, mixed with a hint of something metallic, like an old penny. It was unsettling. Once, I found a child's crude drawing on the polished floor of the main hallway. It was a stick figure, holding hands with a larger, shadowy figure. The shadowy figure had no face, just empty space. It was childlike but deeply disturbing, like a child's hand trying to draw something it shouldn't be seeing. One evening, I was doing my rounds on the second floor, checking the bedrooms. The house was in its usual oppressive silence. As I walked past the door to what looked like an old nursery, I heard it. A faint, almost inaudible giggle. It was a child's giggle, light and playful, but it echoed eerily in the empty house, carrying a strange, hollow quality. It seemed to come from inside the nursery. My heart pounded. I froze, listening. Nothing. I waited, holding my breath. Then a small, distinct thump, like a ball bouncing softly, came from inside the room. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that there was a child, or children, in this supposedly empty and childless house. I slowly approached the nursery door. It was old, painted white, with faded decorations of lambs and clouds. The giggle sounded again, a little louder, a little closer. It sounded like it was coming from right behind the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. It was cold to the touch. I slowly pushed it open. The nursery was bathed in moonlight, filtering through a single unboarded window. It was filled with old, antique toys. A rocking horse stood still in the corner. A crib was draped with a faded lace canopy. There was no child there, but in the center of the room, lying on the dusty floor, was a single, brightly colored rubber ball. It was one of those old-fashioned ones, striped red and yellow. It looked perfectly clean, almost new, standing out starkly against the grime of the room. As I stared at it, the ball slowly, subtly, rolled a few inches to the left. Then it stopped. My blood ran cold. My mind tried to rationalize it. A draft, the floor isn't level, but the house was still, the air unmoving. And then another faint giggle, this time much closer, almost right next to my ear. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there, just empty air. The smell of old candy and metallic pennies was strong now, making my stomach churn. Then I heard a new sound, a soft, wet plink-plink coming from the crib. It sounded like something dripping. I moved towards it, slowly, cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. As I got closer, the dripping sound became clearer. It wasn't water, it was thicker, more viscous. And then I saw it. Inside the antique crib, amidst the faded lace, was a small, crudely made doll. It was fashioned from twigs and cloth, its face drawn with charcoal. Its tiny, stitched eyes seemed to stare up at me, and from its mouth, a thick, dark red liquid was slowly dripping onto the white lace of the crib. It looked like blood, fresh blood, and from inside the doll, I heard a faint, tiny voice, distorted and high-pitched like a broken music box playing a child's cry. "Play with us," it whispered. "Play with us, forever." My mind shattered. The ball, the giggles, the footprints, the drawings, and now this. This wasn't just kids. This was something ancient, something evil. It was using the guise of children to lure me, to play its game. I screamed, a raw, terrified sound. I didn't stop to think, didn't try to close the crib, didn't try to look for the source of the voice. I just turned and ran, stumbling out of the room, down the stairs and out the front door, leaving it wide open. I didn't stop until I was in my car, shaking, sobbing, my hands clenched so tight on the steering wheel my knuckles were white. I drove away from the Thorne estate that day and never went back. I quit my job, gave up security work. I tried to explain what I saw, what I heard, but no one believed me. They said the house was empty. They said I was stressed, overworked, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I still hear those faint giggles sometimes, especially when it's quiet. I still smell that sickly sweet old candy and metallic pennies when I least expect it. I see those little footprints in my mind, and I know, with absolute certainty, that some houses are not just empty. They are waiting for someone to come inside, someone to play. And the children of Blackwood Manor, or their echoes, are still there, still playing, forever. My name is Emily Thorne. I was a relatively new babysitter, just starting out in my neighborhood. I mostly took jobs for families I knew or through trusted recommendations. It was good money, easy work, or so I thought. I believed in the innocence of children, the safety of homes. But then I took a job for the Davies family. That house and the young boy I watched shattered all my illusions. It taught me that some homes harbor things far older and more malevolent than their foundations, and some children are merely the gatekeepers. The Davies house was a charming little bungalow tucked away on a quiet street. It had a neat garden, a white picket fence, and smelled faintly of baking cookies. Mr. and Mrs. Davies were a friendly couple, slightly frazzled but kind. They had one child, 7-year-old Oscar. "Oscar's usually a good boy," Mrs. Davies said with a nervous laugh. "He just has trouble sleeping sometimes. He gets scared of the dark." They gave me clear instructions about his bedtime routine, snacks, and the emergency numbers. They left for a dinner party, promising to be back before midnight. The evening started peacefully. Oscar was a sweet, slightly shy boy. We played with his toy cars for a while, then I read him a story. He seemed happy, but I noticed he kept glancing at the shadows in the corners of his room. He'd pull his blanket tighter, even though the room was warm. When it was time for bed, he insisted I leave his nightlight on and the door cracked open. "Just a little," he pleaded, his voice small. The house then settled into a comfortable quiet. It was the usual silence of a house where a child is asleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling of Oscar's unease. I told myself it was just a child's natural fear of the dark. About an hour after Oscar was in bed, I heard a soft, rhythmic scratching sound. It was coming from Oscar's room. It wasn't loud enough to be an animal, more like something light but persistent, being dragged across the floor. I thought perhaps Oscar had woken up and was playing with one of his toys, but the sound was too even, too deliberate. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch, scratch, pause. It sounded like fingernails on wood. My heart gave a small flutter. "Oscar?" I called out, but softly. No answer. The scratching stopped immediately. I waited, listening intently, but there was only silence. I rationalized it as a creaking house or my imagination, but my instincts were starting to prickle. The air in the hallway outside Oscar's room felt strangely colder than the rest of the house. And then, a few minutes later, the scratching started again. This time, it was accompanied by a faint, breathy whisper. It sounded like a child's voice, very soft but distorted, as if speaking through a cloth. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound itself was deeply unsettling. It was too soft to be Oscar's voice, too strange. My heart pounded against my ribs. Something was wrong. I slowly got up from the sofa and walked towards Oscar's room. His door was still cracked open, letting a sliver of the nightlight glow escape. The scratching and whispering grew louder as I approached, more distinct. It was definitely coming from inside his room. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open a little wider. Oscar was sitting up in bed, his back to the door, staring intently at the far wall. His small body was rigid, perfectly still. He wasn't playing with anything. He was just staring. And on the wall he was staring at, right in the center, a faint, glowing green light pulsed softly. It was a strange, otherworldly green, not like any nightlight I had ever seen, and the scratching was coming from that light, from within the wall. The whispers, too, emanated from that spot, now a little clearer, almost like a lullaby, but a twisted, off-key one. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a nightlight. This wasn't Oscar's room. This wasn't normal. The air around the green light felt impossibly cold, making my breath fog. I could smell something faint, something metallic and sweet, like stale candy and rust. "Oscar?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. He just kept staring at the glowing green light, his eyes wide and unblinking. The scratching grew frantic, more urgent, like something desperately trying to get out. The whispers became a chorus, a multitude of tiny, childlike voices, all murmuring the same phrase over and over, "Come and play. Come and play with us." Suddenly, the green light on the wall pulsed brighter, then pulsed again, and then a section of the wallpaper around it began to ripple, to stretch outwards, as if something was pushing from behind. Slowly, a small, pale hand, far too thin, with long, delicate fingers, began to emerge from the center of the green light. It was an alien hand, glowing with the same eerie green light. It reached out, slowly, directly towards Oscar. My mind shattered. This wasn't a hallucination. This was real. This was a nightmare made flesh. I screamed, a raw, terrified sound, and lunged forward trying to grab Oscar, to pull him away from the reaching hand. But as I touched his arm, his skin was icy cold, colder than anything I'd ever felt. He was stiff, rigid, his eyes still fixed on the wall, completely unseeing, as if in a trance. The green hand wrapped its delicate, glowing fingers around Oscar's wrist. He didn't resist. He didn't even twitch. He just let himself be pulled, slowly, towards the wall, towards the pulsing green light. The whispers grew louder, more triumphant, a chilling chorus of childish glee. "He comes! He comes to play!" I pulled on Oscar with all my strength, screaming his name, but it was like pulling against an invisible anchor. He was being drawn in, slowly but inexorably, into the wall. As his small body was pulled closer, the wallpaper around the green light began to crack and crumble, revealing not plaster, but a swirling vortex of deep emerald green. It was like looking into another dimension, a place of sickly green light and unseen depths. Oscar's leg was pulled in, then his waist. His body was disappearing into the green void, his eyes still wide, still fixed on the unearthly light, no longer showing fear, but a strange, vacant acceptance. I screamed again, a desperate, hopeless sound, as his arm slipped from my grasp. The last thing I saw was Oscar's face, his mouth open in a soundless scream, his eyes reflecting the eerie green light as he was fully pulled into the swirling vortex. Then, with a soft, sickening squelch, the green light faded. The wall repaired itself instantly, the wallpaper seamlessly closing, leaving no trace, no mark, only the faint scent of stale candy and rust in the now silent room. I collapsed to the floor, shaking uncontrollably, sobbing, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I huddled there, my body numb with terror, until the Davies family returned hours later. They found me a hysterical mess on the floor, Oscar's room empty, no signs of anything unusual. They thought I had lost my mind, that I had hurt Oscar. I was arrested, questioned for weeks, my life turned upside down, but they could never prove anything. Oscar was just gone, no trace, but the horror, the memory of that night, lives with me every single day. I still see that glowing green hand reaching from the wall. I still hear those faint, distorted whispers. Come and play with us. I see Oscar's vacant eyes, slowly pulled into the green void. I never babysat again. I can't even look at shadows in a room without feeling a knot of dread. I see every wall, every dark corner, and I wonder what lies behind them, what waits for lonely children. And I know, with absolute certainty, that some walls are not just walls. They are thresholds. And some children are not just children. They are offerings. Some places are cheap because the previous guests never lived to leave bad reviews. Some homes aren't just houses, they are waiting rooms for the unknown. And some children are not just watching the TV, they're watching the watcher, waiting for the right moment to play.